The coffee cup hit the marble counter so hard, the lid cracked. Again, Vanessa Laurent said, her voice cutting through the morning rush of the Hartwell Tower Cafe like a scalpel through silk. She stood in a tailored navy dress, dark hair swept over one shoulder, one manicured hand still extended from the throw. Around her, the usual tide of executives and junior staff slowed to a careful crawl. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They just watched. Behind the counter, the woman making their coffee, perfectly steamed, perfectly timed, perfectly right, said nothing at all. She simply reached for a clean cup, her movements controlled, her face composed, revealing nothing. This was not the first time, and it would not be the last. Vivian Hart was the founder and chief executive officer of Hartwell Global. She had built it from a single logistics consultancy operating out of a borrowed office in her late 20s into a massive corporation managing 4 verticals across 11 countries. It represented 18 years of strategy, 18 years of knowing exactly what people could accomplish. But knowing what they could do had never told her who they were. She had walked into Hartwell Tower 17 days ago, carrying a forged resume and a barista certification pulled from a community college program. Richard Holloway, the board chairman and the only other person who knew her true identity, had arranged for hidden cameras to be installed before she started. 2 days later, she began filling a small notebook with her observations. The company was 3 weeks away from the largest internal restructuring in its history. A billion-dollar expansion into Southeast Asian markets required appointing a new president, someone who would shape the organization's next decade. The board had narrowed the field to 3 candidates, and Damian Cross was the presumed frontrunner. As the head of strategic development, he was a high performer and charming in formal settings. He was the kind of executive who closed high-stakes deals and effortlessly built relationships. He was also the kind of executive who had appeared on Vivian's observation list 6 times in 17 days. His entries were not for dramatic transgressions, but for texture. The way he left empty cups at the razor edge of the counter rather than the collection point, 3 inches too far for convenience, but close enough to maintain deniability. The way his tone subtly shifted when he spoke to women versus men. The way he laughed when others were visibly uncomfortable. The way his girlfriend had started visiting, and how he validated every small cruelty she performed. Vivian had learned twice in her career that the most dangerous thing about power was the people who orbited it. Titles told her what a person could do. She needed to know who they were when they believed no one important was watching. She needed to see how they treated the people they thought didn't matter. So, she had done what very few leaders were willing to do. She came down. The cafe served every floor. Executives passed through it 4, 5, sometimes 6 times a day. It was the one place in the building where rank became, or should have become, invisible. Vivian worked it quietly, learning the rhythms of the room and cataloging what she saw. She noted who thanked the staff and who looked straight through them, who extended small courtesies and who inflicted small cruelties. She had 12 pages of notes already, and Damian appeared on 6 of them. She refilled the coffee beans and called out the next order. Across the room, an intern named Lucas, 23 and barely 3 months into the job, stacked cups with focused, unnecessary precision. Near the service door, an elderly maintenance worker named Samuel moved slowly with his cart, navigating the heavy foot traffic without interrupting it. Vivian had spoken to him almost every morning, noticing the quiet dignity with which he moved through a building that barely acknowledged his existence. She had written his name down on the 2nd day. From the lounge area, she could hear Damian's voice booming across the room. He was discussing a client dinner, the upcoming announcement next week, and what already felt like a coronation decided in his favor. Vivian pulled a shot of espresso and watched the golden crema form. She kept her face exactly where she had learned to keep it during 18 years in corporate boardrooms, composed, revealing nothing, and reading everything. The game had already begun. Vivian observed the rhythms of the cafe, without judgment and without rush. Damian visited 4 or 5 times daily. His orders were notoriously vague. He would ask for something smooth or bright, and then act disappointed when his unstated preferences weren't anticipated. He never said thank you. His eyes always looked past her, searching for the next thing he needed. Vanessa's visits intensified. The first had been manageable, but the second had escalated. Now, her appearances were entirely unpredictable in their aggression, yet remarkably consistent in their cruelty. Vivian watched how the rest of the room responded. She watched Damien perform for the crowd, radiating the warmth, charm, and ease of someone who had never been told no. She watched him validate his girlfriend's behavior with eager attention and laughter. Around them, she watched the rest of the room perform compliance, a deference born of mortgages, performance reviews, and quarterly targets. Lucas, the young intern, always tried to disappear during these moments. His shoulders would tighten, and his hands would move with erratic, unnecessary precision. Vivian saw a young man caught between bearing witness and involuntary complicity, and she recognized that it cost him something inside. Meanwhile, Samuel moved through the space with a quiet grace. In 17 days, he had spoken to her almost every morning. They didn't talk about the cafe, but about nothing and everything: the weather, the crowd, and sharp observations about human patterns. He noticed things. He was the only person in the building who saw her as a human being rather than a function. Mia from reception also came in regularly. Quiet and observant, Mia's eyes would widen slightly whenever Vanessa was cruel. When Vanessa finally left, Mia would mouth a silent apology to Vivian, not to excuse herself, but to affirm that she recognized the injustice of the interaction. Sophia Lynn, a junior analyst, frequently worked from a table near the window. She had completely stopped typing the day Vanessa first visited. Now, her fingers would hover and still over the keyboard whenever Vanessa spoke. She was uncomfortable, hyper-aware, and afraid. Vivian filled her notebook not with judgments, but with clinical observations, patterns that revealed who these people truly were beneath the surface they presented to power. Damien's pattern was undeniable. He mistook silence for assent. He benefited from his girlfriend's cruelty because it created an intimidating energy he didn't have to generate himself. He laughed at the discomfort of others because he had never experienced the professional cost of speaking up. His moral awareness stopped exactly where his personal comfort began. 3 weeks before the executive appointment, Vivian knew everything she needed to know about Damien Cross. But she was waiting for the perfect moment that would crystallize it, the moment that would leave no room for doubt. She was waiting for Vanessa to go too far. Vanessa arrived on a slow afternoon when the cafe crowd had thinned to a handful of people nursing cold drinks. She walked in with the distinct energy of someone who had been waiting for the audience to clear, not because she wanted privacy, but because she wanted absolute control of the stage. She approached the counter without joining the queue, deliberately stepping around Mia, who had been waiting quietly for 2 minutes. "I'll have the same as this morning," Vanessa demanded. "And make sure it's right this time." Then, as Vivian positioned the portafilter into the machine, Vanessa added, "I've been watching you. You have the look of someone who thinks they're above this job." Vivian said nothing. "I've had assistants like that," Vanessa continued. "They think being quiet makes them seem deep. It doesn't. It just makes them seem difficult. What did you study? Or did you?" "I studied," Vivian said simply. "And this is where it got you." Vanessa smiled, as though she were delivering an act of mercy. "There's no shame in that. Not everyone has the mind for real work. This is honest labor, as long as you're grateful for it." Mia blinked in shock, but moved aside. From behind her laptop near the window, Sophia Lynn stopped typing entirely. She wasn't reading her screen. She was watching the exchange without appearing to watch. Vivian set the finished beverage on the counter. Vanessa looked down at it, then glared up at her. "I want it with regular milk." "You ordered oat milk." "I'm changing my order." A heavy, deliberate pause followed. "Is that a problem?" Vivian held her gaze for a single, quiet beat. Then, she calmly took the cup back. Vanessa watched her with the patient expression of someone who enjoyed waiting, simply because the waiting itself asserted her dominance. "You're replaceable, you know. Every single person in a job like this is entirely replaceable. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because I think you need to hear it." People in service positions sometimes develop an inflated sense of their own importance. Suddenly, Samuel paused. His maintenance cart stopped mid-stride. He looked at Vanessa slowly, then turned his gaze to Vivian. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence. "There's no need for that kind of talk. She's doing her job. Speak to her properly." The room stilled instantly. Even the ambient hum of the espresso machine seemed to lower its pitch. Vanessa's expression hardened into something incredibly cold. "I don't need guidance on how to speak to people from the maintenance staff." Samuel nodded once, slowly. It was not a gesture of defeat, but the specific nod of a man who had said what needed to be said and required absolutely nothing from the response. He calmly moved on with his cart. Vivian placed the remade drink on the counter without a word. Vanessa snatched it and swept out of the room. Behind her, Mia stepped up to the counter, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm so sorry about that. She had absolutely no right." Vivian looked at her for a moment, her expression unreadable. "What would you like to order?" But beneath the counter, Vivian had already reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the small notebook. She added 2 more names to a list that was quickly growing. 3 days before the boardroom announcement, Vanessa returned to the cafe alongside Damien. The dynamic between them had shifted in a way Vivian recognized instantly. The unmistakable shift that happens in a couple when one of them has been promised a massive promotion, and both are already spending the money. Damien was looser and more expansive than usual. He shook hands vigorously with his senior manager passing through the lobby and laughed loudly at a mundane comment an assistant made. He was rehearsing the energy of someone who had already arrived at the top. Vanessa moved beside him with the ease of someone who felt she had fully arrived as well. They ordered, and Vivian efficiently prepared the drinks. The exchange was entirely unremarkable until Vanessa, mid-sentence with Damien, gestured grandly with her hand and caught the edge of a standing display, tipping it completely over. Plastic cups and branded napkins scattered wildly across the service floor. The moment hung in a tense silence for a second before Vanessa looked directly at Vivian. "You want to clean that up?" It was not a request, nor was it even a command in the traditional sense. It was a flat declaration of how the world was ordered, delivered without heat because she believed it required none. Damien glanced down at the floor, then quickly looked away, remaining silent. Vivian came around the counter with a cloth. As she crouched down to collect the scattered cups, Vanessa's voice drifted down from above her. "See, Damien? She doesn't complain. That's all I ask. Just do the job." Lucas, who was restocking cups at the far end of the counter, went completely still. Across the room, Sophia snapped her laptop shut. Vivian stood up slowly, the items collected and her expression completely unchanged. She looked down at the counter, deliberately avoiding Vanessa's eyes. "I've seen enough," Vivian said. She spoke quietly, more to herself than to anyone else in the room. But Lucas heard it clearly. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, the back of his neck went completely cold. He felt a sudden, powerful shift in the room, a distinct current moving through the cafe. It was the heavy current of a final decision being made. At exactly 8 a.m. the following morning, a mandatory email was distributed to all senior staff, directors, and board members. Mandatory all-hands presentation. Location, main boardroom, 41st floor. Time, Friday at 11 a.m. There is no agenda attached. Attendance is strictly required and will be conducted by the office of the chairman. Damien read the notification on his phone while sitting in his car and immediately dialed Richard Holloway. "Richard, is this the official announcement?" "Come to the boardroom at 11, Richard replied flatly. "You'll have your answers there." Damien hung up, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. He texted Vanessa a single word, "Friday." She replied instantly with a champagne emoji. Up in her corner office on the 32nd floor, a floor that no one in the cafe had ever connected to the quiet woman making their coffee, Vivian read Richard's confirmation email. She closed her laptop and looked out over the sprawling city skyline for a long moment. The morning light washed over the high-rises, the very same light that was currently reaching the cafe 40 floors below. Then, she walked over to her executive closet and picked up the barista apron she had neatly folded and brought up the night before. She laid it intentionally across the back of her leather chair. She wasn't quite finished with it yet. The executive boardroom on the 41st floor held 40 people comfortably, and every inch of it was structurally designed to make visitors feel the immense gap between where they sat and where power resided. By 10:55 a.m., every single seat was filled. Senior directors, department heads, and the board's inner circle occupied the main table. Assistants and junior managers pressed tightly along the perimeter of the room, having been invited via a secondary email that had baffled most of them. Lucas stood near the double doors, clutching his tablet tightly against his chest, trying his best to look as though he understood why he had been summoned. Mia sat 3 seats from the front row, her spine perfectly straight and her hands folded neatly in her lap. Samuel had been personally escorted to the room by Richard's executive assistant and was seated prominently in the second row. Nobody else in the room seemed to know what to make of his presence. Damien arrived at 10:58 a.m. wearing his finest tailored suit, a charcoal, double-breasted cut he usually saved for high-profile client presentations. Confidence radiated from him. Vanessa waited just outside in the lobby, having successfully convinced the reception desk to let her wait near the boardroom entrance. She had dressed explicitly for a celebration. At the front of the room, Richard Holloway stood talking quietly with 2 members of the board. He looked at no one else, keeping his eyes fixed firmly on the door. The massive presentation screens behind him remained dark. At 11 a.m. sharp, the door opened. It was not the main double doors, but the narrow, staff access cut into the presentation wall. Vivian Hart walked through, and she was still wearing it. The dark barista apron, stained faintly on the left side where espresso had splashed across it 2 days ago. The room did not register her identity immediately. Then, heads began to turn. A wave of comprehension rippled through the space like an electric current. A senior director who had frequented the cafe that week inhaled sharply. A woman near the back pressed a hand over her mouth. Lucas felt the floor tilt slightly beneath his feet. Damien's face contorted through 4 distinct expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, followed by amusement, transitioning into uncertainty, and finally settling into the slow, nauseating arrival of total comprehension. Richard Holloway stepped forward to the microphone. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you all for being here. Before we begin our presentation, I would like to make a formal introduction. For those of you who do not know her by sight, and it appears many of you do not, allow me to present the founder and chief executive officer of Hartwell Global, Vivian Hart. He turned slightly and gestured toward her. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the polite, expectant silence of a corporate introduction, but the held-breath panic of a room in which multiple high-ranking individuals were simultaneously recalculating every single thing they had said and done over the past 17 days. Vivian moved to the podium without a hint of hurry. She placed her small, slightly worn notebook onto the surface and looked out at the sea of faces. I spent nearly 3 weeks in this building's cafe, she began, her voice calm and carrying perfectly across the room. I made coffee. I wiped down counters. I restocked supplies. And above all else, I watched. She reached forward and pressed the remote. The massive screens behind her flared to life. The surveillance footage was crystal clear and time-stamped. The cameras had been professionally positioned at the ceiling corners, perfectly angled to capture faces and audio with flawless fidelity. The first clip loaded in total silence. Vanessa's first visit played across 4 screens simultaneously. The audio was pristine, and Vanessa's words cut through the boardroom with a crushing weight they had not been allowed to carry the first time. A college dropout could make this. The screen flickered, shifting to the clip of the spilled display. Vanessa's deliberate, patronizing tone echoed through the speakers. You'll want to clean that. Then came the clip from A Morning Rush, replaceable. No shame in that. Finally, the footage shifted to Samuel, quiet and unhurried, stopping his maintenance cart. His voice filled the boardroom. Ma'am, there's no need for that kind of talk. She's doing her job. Speak to her properly. Someone in the back row exhaled an audible gasp. Vivian let the footage run until it reached the exact moment she had muttered, "I've seen enough," and then she paused the video. "I did not go down to that cafe looking for failures," Vivian said, breaking the silence. "I went down looking for character." Those are two entirely different concepts, and I want to be precise about the distinction because it matters to the survival of this firm. For the first time since entering the room, she looked directly at Damien. He had not moved an inch. He sat with the rigid stillness of a man who understood completely that movement of any kind would only accelerate his fall. The presidency of Hartwell Global requires an executive who fundamentally understands that the way you treat people with no visible power is the most accurate metric of your leadership, Vivian stated firmly. Not your financial results, not your strategy documents, not the high-stakes deals you have closed. The ultimate measure is this. What do you do when you believe no one of consequence is watching? She closed her notebook with a decisive snap. Damien Cross's employment with Hartwell Global is terminated, effective immediately. His department will be restructured under interim leadership pending a comprehensive conduct review. That review will also thoroughly examine the broader culture of his floor, which this footage heavily suggests has been a problem for much longer than 17 days. Damien suddenly stood up. "Vivian, please, I didn't—" He stopped. Whatever defense he had intended to mount, he couldn't find the words to finish it. "You have nothing of value to add," she said, her tone devoid of cruelty. It was simply a statement of fact. Deflated, he sat back down. Vivian moved through the rest of the meeting with the clinical precision of someone who had been building toward this climax for weeks and had no desire to drag it out. "The promotions that were currently pending have been completely reshuffled," she announced. "Two project leads who treated our support staff with consistent respect are being elevated to senior director roles, effective immediately." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the room. Lucas Reed. Lucas felt his legs turn a lead. He managed to stand up, his heart hammering against his ribs. "You are 23 years old, and you're brand new to this corporate environment," Vivian said, looking directly at him. "You watched a fellow human being undergo public humiliation, and you felt visibly wronged by it, even though the professional cost of speaking up was a terrifying risk for someone in your entry-level position. You felt the weight of that silence. That tells me you possess a conscience. You are being placed on a senior development track starting next month." Lucas nodded numbly, barely able to process the words as he sat back down. "Mia Carter." Mia stood up, her posture immaculate. "You offered a sincere apology to a barista you had no idea was the CEO of this company," Vivian said. "You recognized a blatant injustice and went out of your way to affirm the person who was wronged, despite being socially junior to every executive in that room. You are being promoted to corporate coordinator for our new Southeast Asian expansion." Mia's eyes widened in shock. She nodded once, a brilliant flash of gratitude crossing her face. Vivian then turned her gaze toward the second row, focusing entirely on Samuel. "Samuel Brooks has worked in this building for 11 years. In the 3 weeks I spent downstairs, he was the single person in that cafe who possessed the moral fortitude to intervene in a public humiliation, and he did it with absolutely no guarantee of protection and no audience to perform for. He simply saw an injustice, knew it was wrong, and spoke up." She let the boardroom sit in the heavy silence of that realization. "Samuel has been formally enrolled in Hartwell's executive management training program starting next month, accompanied by a full executive salary adjustment and a direct path to operations leadership. Because 11 years of invisible excellence should no longer remain invisible in this company." Samuel looked down at his weathered hands for a long moment. When he looked back up, his expression wasn't one of shock or frantic surprise. It was the quiet, dignified acknowledgement of a man who had known his own worth for a very long time and had simply been waiting for the world to catch up. The boardroom cleared out slowly. Executives and directors moved with extreme care, processing information that shattered long-held corporate assumptions. Some stopped to speak with Richard Holloway in hushed whispers. Others fled without a single word, staring straight ahead. Damien left quietly through the side exit. Vivian did not watch him go. Outside in the lobby, Vanessa was swiftly escorted from the floor before the boardroom doors even reopened. She had been standing near the glass partitions when the surveillance footage began to play, and a member of the corporate security team had quietly requested that she vacate the premises immediately. She did not cause a scene. Whatever she had imagined this Friday would look like, she had never envisioned this. Imagination requires a familiar picture to fall back on when reality fails. Vanessa had no structural framework for a world where the people she dismissed suddenly held all the power. The grand boardroom had nearly emptied when Lucas stepped back through the double doors. He stood hovering at the edge of the expansive room, tablet still clutched in his hand, looking at Vivian with a complex mixture of awe and curiosity. "Ms. Hart, may I ask you a question?" Vivian was gathering her notebook from the podium. She looked up and met his eyes. "Go ahead, Lucas." "What?" He paused, struggling to articulate his thoughts. "I mean, you have access to every performance report, metric, and consultant file in the company. You could have just reviewed the records. Why go to such lengths? Why do it like this?" Vivian looked down at the barista apron still draped over the edge of the mahogany podium. "Because files only tell me what people are capable of accomplishing," she explained softly. "What I desperately needed to know was who they are. People change their behavior entirely when they're standing in front of power. They straighten their posture, they select better words, and they remember to be gracious. That curated version of themselves isn't completely useless, but it isn't the truth." She picked up the apron and began folding it with neat, highly deliberate movements. "I needed to see what they do to the people they think don't matter." Lucas was silent for a moment, absorbing the philosophy. "And what about me? I didn't actually do anything. I just handed you napkins. I just watched. But you looked deeply uncomfortable every single time it happened," Vivian countered. "There's a cynical version of corporate logic where that doesn't count for much. But you were young, you were new, and the psychological cost of speaking up in that toxic environment was very real for someone in your position. You felt the wrongness of the room." She looked at him with an encouraging smile. "That tells me that when you have the corporate standing and authority to protect people, you will choose to use it. That is what matters to me." Lucas nodded slowly, a wave of relief washing over him. Then, a sudden realization hit him, and he couldn't help but smile. "I actually recognized you during the second week. I remembered your face from an old company newsletter." Vivian nodded knowingly. "I am well aware." He blinked, stunned. "You knew. You avoided direct eye contact with me for 2 consecutive days afterward," she said with a soft chuckle. "And then, you went right back to treating me normally. That choice also told me everything I needed to know about your character." Lucas let out a short breath of pure disbelief, shook his head in admiration, thanked her quietly, and exited the boardroom. The space was entirely empty now. Vivian stood alone as the warm afternoon light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the exact same light that was currently cutting through the glass of the cafe 40 floors below. She thought of Samuel, quietly moving through the corridors of the building for 11 long years. Consistent, graceful, waiting for a room that finally saw him for who he was. She thought about the immense cost an organization pays when it allows that kind of human capital to go completely to waste. Vivian picked up her notebook and walked out into the corridor. The barista apron she left behind, resting neatly on the polished wood of the table. She didn't need it anymore. The vital work it had been hired to do was finally finished.